Hi, and welcome to another episode with me, your host, Arvid Viana. And a lot of recent episodes have focused on carbon markets. But what happens when firms don't have an explicit cap on emissions? In other words, how do firms then decide on their voluntary carbon reductions? Because such emission reductions are often costly and could put firms at a competitive disadvantage. Furthermore, we often talk about firms as an abstraction, but firms are made out of people and divisions and so on, and those can have different objectives. In addition, firms operate under national laws and international environment. So it is a very complex question on how firms decide on their voluntary emission reductions. But today's guest, Lily Hsueh, has written a great book analyzing this problem called Corporations at Climate Crossroads: Multi-Level Governments, Public Policy, and Global Climate Action. And this book is available for free through open access. And you can find a link below where you can go and get the PDF. And Lily is an associate professor of economics and public policy at Arizona State University and a senior global futures scientist at ACU's Julie Ann Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory. She's also an affiliate scholar with Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment, and she earned her PhD in public policy and management from the University of Washington. And she studies how firms, markets, and government policy shape environmental and climate governments. So Lily, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
I am excited. Today is my first interview covering a book. So what is the book about?
At its core, the book is about the supply and demand of corporate climate action. So we know the stakes. Roughly 100 fossil fuel producers are linked to 70% of annual global industrial emissions. But because these emissions transcend national borders, it is not always possible to rely solely on traditional jurisdictional policy tools, and a huge portion of the global response remains voluntary. And so what I do in this book is that I draw from economics, political science, and management to ask three fundamental questions. The first one is, what political and economic factors drive a firm to take action? Does the voluntary or proactive action actually result in lower carbon emissions, or is it really just noise? And how do these drivers change when you move across sectors or from developed to developing economies? And so to answer this, I move beyond seeing the firm as a black box, a simple profit maximizer. Instead, I also look at the internal organizational behavior and firm level dynamics. I examine how managerial preferences and firms' unique complementary business capabilities, like their existing expertise in innovation or a more flexible supply chain, determine whether a company sees climate change either as a threat to be managed or as a strategic opportunity. And what I argue is that corporate behavior is shaped by a nested structure of governance. And what that really means is the interplay of these internal firm level dynamics, including managerial capacity, domestic policy, and top-down global norms matter. And together they drive corporate behavior on climate. And so what I do empirically is I use econometrics analysis of global 500 and S&P 500 firms from 2011 to 2020 to show that when firms face high uncertainty, their response isn't random. It's a strategic mix of executive and managerial leadership, organizational capabilities, and then the way they proactively engage with the regulatory process as well as global governance. And then one thing that I do, I think, is also a contribution is that in investigating corporate climate action, the book differentiates between symbolic pledges, so these net zero pledges by firms, and their substantive emissions reductions. And so in this way, I'm able to address the longstanding concerns about greenwashing. So that's maybe not in quite a nutshell, but a summary of what the book is about.
Why did you decide to write a book?
Oh, thanks so much for that question. As you said in the intro, I'm an economist and policy scholar by training. And this quest really began about a decade ago when I was at a workshop on transnational governance at the Oxford Public School. Um, and, I was in a room with political scientists and policy scholars, and they really kind of forced me to look at the issue differently. I realized that to really truly understand climate action, particularly the role of firms, you really can't isolate economics from politics. And I began to see multinational corporations in particular operate in a nested structure of governance where firm level constraints are just as salient as global level drivers. And as we talked about right before the podcast started, is that a book it had to me seemed necessary because a standard journal article doesn't fully capture its complexity, all the different issues that I wanted to talk about. I can't just in a journal article, I can't just look beyond one policy or one sector. And in this book, I want to show the interplay between market leverage, political authority, and organizational behavior. And these firms have the scale to change the course of human history, really. And really trying to understand what drives them requires more of a kind of holistic and maybe even multidisciplinary lens that a book can provide. And that's what I do in this book is really bring together economics, political science, and management to bring to bear to understand corporate climate action. And then the final push really happened around 2018. An editor at MIT Press reached out to me at the ASSA conference. She saw an abstract of an article I was writing on firms and climate mitigation, and she asked if this topic may warrant a book. And at that point, I realized that the data that I was looking at and the framework I was really implicitly developing kind of in my mind, that I really wanted to, put it down on paper and use the book as the larger canvas to tell the larger story.
And that's we'll get to more about each of the sections of your book later, but I actually got that from your book. Like, you use each chapter to highlight the different levels, the intersections. So I can see why you wanted to then do it as a book, because like as a journal article, you can only do so much in 30, 40 pages. So correct me if I'm wrong, but you mostly focus on the larger firms. Just to give some reference for the readers, could you talk about how much emissions these global businesses represent?
Yeah, no, definitely. So, um, what is really interesting is that global businesses represent close to 70% of annual global industrial greenhouse gas emissions. And in fact, a majority of global carbon emissions can be traced back to just about 100 corporations. And so when you really consider that sheer size, not just in terms of their carbon footprints, but their economic contribution and market power, it really becomes clear that there really needs to be a spotlight on exactly what these companies are doing, what motivates them, what are the various factors, whether it's internal to the firm, at the policy level, or even do global norms matter? And so that is why there is this, I in this book have this deeper investigation on what actually motivates global businesses.
Exactly. And then I think a central theme to your book of
Yeah.
like you collected a lot of data, and then um you also work around the carbon disclosure project. Could you talk a
Yes.
little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So let me start by kind of maybe sharing the setting of the firm. So the book is set during the critical window of 2011 to 2020. So this is a decade surrounding the Paris Agreement. This really allowed me to observe like how expectations of global governance actually translate into firm behavior on the ground as well. And so to study this, I built a global sustainable business and climate action database. It's essentially a census of the world's largest corporations by revenue and market capitalization. And so the Fortune Global 500s and the S&P 500 companies, these are the publicly traded companies. And didn't want to just look at their climate pledges, the net zero pledges, if you will. I wanted also to track their actual effort. And so to do that, the database follow their voluntary carbon disclosure through their through the CDP, which I'll speak on briefly in a bit, companies' adoption of internal carbon pricing, their um, quantitative emissions targets, and also their absolute emissions as well as emissions intensity. And I also collect data at the market level and domestic policy level and global level as well. And I can come back to that. But it means briefly share a little bit about the Carbon Disclosure Project. The Carbon Disclosure Project is now called the CDP. It's essentially the world's largest clearinghouse for corporate environmental data. Um, the CDP was founded in 2000, I believe, and the organization is based in London. It operates on behalf of over 700 institutional investors who represent roughly 140 to 150 trillion dollars in assets.
So quite a
Every
lot.
year, yeah, it's quite a lot. So, every year, the CDP surveys thousands of global firms, including the Global 500 and S&P 500, on everything from their emissions and risk management to their internal carbon pricing. They also have surveys on water security issues, forestry management. But in this book, I focus on their annual climate change survey. And just to give you a bit of context, close to about two-thirds of the companies listed in the S&P 500 index voluntarily report to the CDP between 2011 and 2020. And by 2024, nearly 90% of them report to the CDP.
And exactly, so they report all this. And like you say, so first of all, you collected a lot of data yourself, kind of like getting under the hood of these massive firms,
Yes.
because they are massive firms. And then you also used it like disclosure of emissions to then combine that. And I think that's also what I try to capture in the introduction, which I really got from your book. These are massive corporations. So when you've got corporations that big, naturally there's different level, naturally there's like different divisions or types of people working in the organization. And I think your book tries to come up with different types of people in the firm. So could you maybe
Yes.
talk a little bit about those?
Yeah, so as I was talking about the database that I put together, I have data from the firm level, market sector level, and of course the policy level as well. But at the firm level, I look beyond just the revenue or assets to include things like managerial roles, and I believe that's what you're asking me about. So the way the CDP asks, part of the survey is a question that I'm able to exploit and take advantage of, which is there's a question about um, governance and the question I think essentially is, where is the highest level of direct responsibility for climate change within your organization? And another related question is, does your company have a board of directors committee responsible for setting the vision and planning for climate risk management? So these questions are really about kind of like the level of authority. And so I'm able to capture that because one of the things I really wanted to understand is managerial agency, managerial capacity. And so I try to measure that by combining these two data points or data ways of measuring authority. Then I also differentiate kind of executive and senior level managerial capacity from, let's say, an analyst within the company that is just about collecting data and reporting data, because managerial capacity and authority is actually quite important, right? There's a big difference between if a company is just hiring a lower level analyst to do the work of climate reporting versus having someone who is able to help set agendas on climate mitigation and management.
And And I want to get back to the symbolic versus actual reduction.
Yeah.
So, in your book, you also have a chapter about the clean power plant, kind of
Yes.
illustrating these forces. Could you maybe illustrate what you've talked about in the context of the clean power plant?
So to get at the causal link between regulation and managerial agency or capacity, I really needed an exogenous shock, right? Something that changed the regulatory landscape independent of a firm's own choices. And so the Clean Power Plan provided that shock. So even though it never fully went into effect, as we know, between 2014 and 2015, the CPP acted as a credible harbinger of regulatory pressure and regulatory stringency to come. I'm able to argue this because the Clean Power Plan followed a decade of legislative gridlock in the
Lily,
U.S.
maybe, sorry, I should say, I think some people in the US will be aware of the Clean Power Plan, but maybe some of the EU listeners won't be. So could you maybe
Okay.
talk a bit about what it was trying to achieve? Sort of
Yes.
like what the context is, because I think it will help some of the listeners.
Sure. So the Clean Power Plan was introduced by the Obama administration in 2015, but it really was in the works several years before that. It was a landmark EPA policy aimed at combating climate change by setting the first ever U.S. national limits on carbon pollution from existing power plants. At that time, it targeted about a 30% or so reduction in the power sector emissions from 2005 levels. It was later repealed, and that said, um, around the mid 2010, so 2014, 2015, around the time, it was considered by the private sector a credible kind of a harbinger of what was to come. And the reason is because it followed a decade of legislative gridlock. And there were, however, um, two two important kind of events in the U.S. The 2007 Supreme Court decision, um, which which what it did was it it showed that the Clean Air Act encompasses greenhouse gas emissions. And then also in 2009, the EPA also um, was able to show that the greenhouse gas emissions endangered public health. So that's what is known as the endangerment finding. And so these two kind of institutional um, declarations effectively shifted the regulatory burden to the EPA, to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, which created a legal mandate that firms at the time couldn't ignore. And so the Clean Power Plan was part of Section 111 of the Clean Air Act. And this CPP was fascinating for two reasons. It was a bureaucratic policy signal. Because it was a bureaucratic design by the EPA rather than a legislative compromise, it was perceived to be less susceptible to lobbying and more likely to stick at the time. We know that that did not happen, but at the time it was perceived that way. Um, it was also was going to be a high adjustment cost because it was a performance-based standard rather than a market mechanism like a carbon
Yeah,
tax, right?
yeah.
So firms viewed it as a high cost threat. So in my model, this created a pre-compliance window, if you will. Firms didn't wanted to wait for the law to be implemented. It started to hedge against it. And so from an econometrician's perspective, I'm able to operationalize this as a quasi-experiment. And I did so in a triple differences estimator, in which I exploited variation in before versus after the Clean Power Plan, um, whether a company was a greenhouse gas intensive um, company or not, because the power sector, but and also in general, the greenhouse gas intensive sectors have felt more threatened by this. And then I also exploited the variation of whether firms had installed an executive or senior level climate manager or not. So those were the three variations that I exploited. And then I am embedded um, the triple differences estimator in a two-stage endogenous binary variable, which then allowed me to look at the extensive margin. So the decision whether a firm will participate in voluntary carbon disclosure through the CDP or not. And then also the intensive margins, the actual entity wide emissions or emissions intensity by a firm.
So this kind of quasi-exogenous shock allowed you to do a lot of econometrics. And so what did you find along those dimensions?
And so, what I found, which was actually quite interesting, is that I found that at the overall, um, overall, as a disclosing firm increase in size, it reduces carbon emissions on a per employee basis. So there is this kind of operational efficiency um, result that I had. That said, a lot of um, this reduction in emissions intensity was driven by firms that had experienced regulatory pressure or had felt that regulatory pressure. So essentially the greenhouse gas intensive firms. Um, and by contrast, in consumer oriented firms, so like retailers and whatnot, what I showed was that there were perverse results. These companies may have been participating in carbon disclosure more for window dressing, if you will. And in fact, we saw these companies' footprints increase. That said, these are also the consumer-oriented companies are also not the carbon-intensive firms that we would necessarily target, right? Or that the Clean Power Plan was actually targeting. But you do see that those that experienced regulation and those that had kind of managerial capacity, reducing carbon intensity or reducing entity-wide carbon emissions, notably in the carbon-intensive sector.
Yeah. And I think it goes back towards the, like you said before, like the capacity within firms, the people that are there, the people that have seeing the regulatory pressure coming, the one that's already there and the one that's in the future. Um, so, because it seems like that would also just be more prevalent in these carbon intensive industries.
That is true. That could be true, and also, another result that I have from the study, which I was able to show kind of quantitatively, but also through um, illustrative case studies, is that those companies with unique complementary business capabilities, so whether it's expertise in green innovation or more flexible supply chains, were also able to respond um, with more taking more of a strategic opportunity kind of posture. And so this is in part uh, why I was able to kind of really consider kind of firms in this kind of nested structure, um, 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 you know, uh, responding to pressures coming, not just kind of from the firm level, but also from policy and from even global norms.
Because you, like you say, this is then the next step. So the Clean Power Plan, I think, is a very nice example of like the interplay between the firms and the national level regulation. But then you go also a step further in your book, and then you look at the international regulations. It's like the third dimension. Um, could you expand more like how you then integrated that? Because it's like you say, that's the Clean Power Plan is a very US focused thing, or like the EU carbon market, but internationally has sometimes less, how should I say, binding, but it can influence a lot of what's happening.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I think to and I explain about that. Let me share that in my book, as part of my kind of multi-level governance framework. I talk about the interplay between firm level managerial capacity agency with that of global norms or global governance. So managers are both regulation brokers, and I can go back to that, but they're also norm brokers. So this is where the global layer comes in. Firms view global governance institutions like the UN Global Compact, for example, or the United Nations at large and their various environmental programs as harbinger of future domestic laws. Because eventually these global ideas, but policy ideas and whatnot will become from expectations to at some point implemented into domestic policies. And so as norm brokers, corporate managers or corporate executives, they join these these epistemic communities. So this is a concept borrowed from international relations, where there are these kind of networks of not just the private sector, but various other stakeholders, whether it's from and global nonprofits to international organizations, where they come together to help define problems and identify the solutions. I had the opportunity to embed myself in large um, sustainability conferences that were both sponsored by the private sector, but also by the United Nations. So one of these conferences is the annual Green Biz conference that happens in Phoenix every year, Phoenix, Arizona, annually. These different kind of actors, different stakeholders come together, and they're not just passive recipients of global norms. So corporate representatives, they're actually translating global best practices into their specific corporate contexts. And they do that by shaping some of these and adopting these norms that they also kind of contest and there's kind of back and forth that happens. And where then these norms eventually become part of market requirements, or what they bring it back in house. So, for example, setting an internal price on carbon. Something that was floating in kind of in global kind of norms for a while, and eventually, then a lot of companies eventually adopt that or embed that into their kind of operations.
Yeah, it's like the way you describe it. They're not just exactly these passive actors sitting there seeing what the regulations are. They're actively trying to give input and shape it too, to then bring it back to.
So I tell some of these kind of narratives inside the book, but I also quantitatively attempt to see the way in which even these more difficult to measure norms and norm brokers in several of the chapters as well. So I hope that the audience will it will go and then download the open access edition of the book and take a look.
Yeah, I'm actually going to put that in the introduction to that. It's open access, which I think is incredible. So, um, when writing this book, because I do like to ask this question sometimes, because research is very much a dynamic process, and we see now the end result. What is like something that maybe surprised you during the writing of this book?
So, one thing I really enjoy. So I am by and large a quantitative scholar. And so in this book, as you know, I do some mixed methods, right? So what I ended up really enjoying was I really enjoy interviewing and hearing diverse perspectives of public and private sector leaders across government, education, technology, finance, retail, apparel, and even hard to abate sectors. I was able to speak to some folks as well. And so altogether, I interviewed about 50 corporate leaders and other stakeholders, which I document in the appendix of my book. And so I really enjoy that, and it was interesting. And amongst the corporate leaders I interviewed, from tech companies like Intel to sporting goods and apparel companies like Adidas, what was interesting was that they talked about aligning sustainability efforts and initiatives across their businesses globally whenever possible. And so what was interesting was that they do that proactively. So there was this idea that it's less of a race to the bottom, but more more likely a race to the top. So this proactive approach allows companies to more seamlessly collect data, respond to pressures that arise domestically and globally, and even minimizing the needed cost of patchy or patchwork efforts later. And and so that was interesting to hear, and these companies are they continue to face demands from their customers, investors, and employees, to be better stewards of the planet, right? So they realize too that it could be it could be costly, these to then have to, later on, do patchwork, catching up, even across jurisdictions that may be today less rigorously regulated.
So thanks. And then I want to get to the international dimension too, but before that, you've now done this whole book. You've actually talked to these people, like you did the quantitative. What do you feel is the most misunderstood aspect about like these corporations and their climate governance?
So let me think. Several things. Um, I think the first thing I will say is that, kind of more of a bigger picture thing is there's both engagement and obstruction that could potentially be happening at the same time. So, um, while we may be seeing active engagement, and we see that across sectors in in um, in hard to abate sectors as well, right? So while we continue to see engagement, in this political moment, we're also going to see the fact that that companies will respond um, to more friendlier kind of policies by Trump, by President Trump. So oil and gas companies will continue to invest in new oil and gas developments, but then they're also heavily um, invested in renewable energy growth and investing, in clean tech, right? In For example, one statistics is really fascinating is that since 2016, investments in clean energy have outpaced fossil fuels globally, and in fact, in 2025, um, that that pace of investment, clean energy investment, outpaced fossil fuels two times globally. And so that's something that I think was surprising, but at the same, and at the same time, you do hear in the news and um, that there is obstruction or attempts of obstruction and turning back of decarbonization efforts as politics change. Companies are facing both pushes and pulls, and it's important not to look at corporations as a unitary actor, if you will. It's complex, and you will see kind of both happening. But indeed, we are also seeing really great engagement, and great strides. And an example, which I don't highlight in the book, but I have been kind of talking about and writing about in kind of more my popular pieces, is Walmart's the Gigat. It's their big project. I think it's called Project Gigaton. Which in 2017 they launched the Project Gigaton, aiming to cut one gigaton of supply chain greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. Suppliers include Nestle, Unilever, Coca-Cola, Samsung, and Heinz, and others helped the company reach its target 6 years early. And they
Wow.
did so through practical means like boosting energy efficiency, redesigning packages, reducing food waste. And so, and and then they were able to verify that data through internal quality controls, and that was kind of co-developed by NGOs like the Environmental Defense Fund. And so what was interesting is that that was happening at the same time. The business, Walmart also grew, right? It's the largest buyer in the world, and so. Um, it's going to be maybe one step forward, one step back. But we need to kind of take into view um, all of this, and understand that corporations have at firm level dynamics that come to play. They're interacting with the regulatory and process and global governance, not just through lobbying, which we know, and there's a great big literature in both economics and political science and elsewhere on lobbying, but they also have in fact really established efforts that initially started as corporate social responsibility, but over time have now been embedded in operations and HR because talent retention is important. That's an important aspect of firm dynamics as well.
That was so cool. I really enjoyed that. I think that's what I like about this podcast. Like it changes my own thinking, and I've never heard someone say it so, you know, beautifully. Like they firms can both engage and obstruct at the same time.
Yes.
Like it, and it's like once you hear them, like yeah, that makes a lot of sense because even with the UETS, you know, part of it is trying to make the targets more flexible, but at the same time, the firms have signed a letter that they still support the ETS. So like
Yes.
part of them supports them, wants to work with them, and then part of the division also is like, yeah, but we're really facing competitive constraints, and I think that's what you really highlight here, also like these interplays and the complexity of the firms. Um, so I really enjoyed that. So then yeah, go ahead. I don't know if you want to add.
Yeah, and one thing I would add is that the a chief reason why in the book I do engage in these different analyses to look at and differentiate between symbolic and substantive action is really, again, trying to take into account both the engagement and obstruction, or maybe obstruction is it's a heavy word, or just maybe sometimes um, less attention to substantive action. And so I do engage in that analysis because I do also want to really kind of make the point because I see it in the data, is that in order for companies to really to succeed in decarbonizing, we do need to keep them accountable, right? And so um, at the end of the day, we do need to continue to to understand that that accountability needs to happen, and that will happen when we are able to design programs and policies that have accountability in mind. um, and and so and there are examples, kind of how that might look like as well.
And because exactly you do talk about this greenwashing. Any thoughts on how we like such proposals or ideas that you had in the course of writing this book, as you've been engaged with it quite a bit?
Yeah, so I think ultimately what we need is that we need to to move from disclosure to verification, right? We need to link voluntary, outputs or these pledges to uh, to 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 really then have that, the intensive margins, the actual emissions reductions, the efforts to really then be able to determine a company's standing. Is it a leader or not? A great model, I think, for this transition is California's Cap and Invest program. It locks in binding targets for, I think, 2045 with real financial consequences. And there are examples in the European policy space as well. But I'll just talk about the California right now. It allows for flexibility, like carbon offsets. I believe that's kind of one of the new policy details. But then it simultaneously then tightened the total allowable emissions cap for firms. So then it essentially transforms disclosures from just a voluntary, reporting into a more verified audit with teeth. And so this is a good example of that kind of multi-level framework, right? It's voluntary action, um, but at the kind of corporate level or global level, which creates capability, but then there's that domestic regulatory policy layer to provide accountability, and so then that allows kind of companies to engage in and to exploit its flexibility. And to let those who are able to do more, um, and ultimately transparency without accountability though is just part of
Yeah.
the noise, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. I also, Lily, I want to be respectful of your time. It's
Yeah.
2 minutes to 7.
Yes.
So, is there anything else you would like to add that we haven't covered so far?
No, this is great. What I'll probably say is maybe then I'll just kind of um, talk about the bottom line of the book, like the main
Yeah.
takeaways that I want maybe our audience to be excited about to read. Or um, so I think my main takeaway is that corporate climate action is not a vacuum. It's oftentimes a strategic response to both kind of bottom up and top down incentives and pressures in institutions. And so, I what I do in this book is I look at corporate policy, sector, and market level data in a kind of a decades time, notably the transition from the pre-Paris to the post-Paris era. And I find that corporate response is really that kind of calculated mix of internal leadership, complementary business capabilities, and proactive engagement, right, with both domestic policy and global governance. And but the book, doesn't stop there. It tells that a more nuanced story. It's I've Their performance do follow disclosure, but that at the same time, for real, credible, um, actual outcomes, environmental performance, sustainability efforts, really and programs that drive these sustainability efforts really need to be tethered with either external policy levers or enforcement mechanisms within these programs, right? Like third party audits or um, certain institutional policy levers to really to get companies to then bring their symbolic pledges to actual outcomes. And firms don't do this in isolation. They really kind of need these kind of multi-level governance frameworks where they're top-down pressure and and need to be then aligned with bottom-up reality of what firms are capable of doing, what they are doing, what they're doing to retain talent, what they're doing to bolster their reputation, right? It's companies, are kind of strategic, rational, profit maximizers. But then, when if they're faced with uncertainty, they may try new things. And there's learning by doing. There's kind of trying out innovative, different things, different programs or initiatives. And so with these different layers working together, then we're able to not just, look at, capture the noise, but also the real true action that's happening.
Awesome. That's amazing. Thank you so much. And I think it really, this conversation, your book, will really help me to think more multidimensional about firms. Because, EU ETS, or like even in the basic econ, it's like we've got a firm, they maximize profit. But by necessity, sometimes you're abstracting from all these internal dynamics, especially in big firms. So thank you so much for taking the time and discussing your book, Lily.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.